You're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Young. It's a big week in global diplomacy as world leaders wrap up the East Asia Summit and gather in Bali for the Group of 20 summit. And what often makes headline news, though, is the talks that happen on the sidelines. And on Monday, the presidents of the United States and China are set to sit down for one-on-one talks amid their worsening relations and intense rivalry. Progress on resolving fundamental differences, such as their positions on Taiwan and human rights, are pretty much unlikely, but they're expected to discuss North Korea, in which they do have a history of cooperation. It's also the first time that the two leaders are set to meet since Biden took office last year, and they're both coming in with renewed confidence after Xi renewed his leadership for what seems to be an indefinite period, and Biden after his party did better than expected at the recent midterm elections. This we also discussed today. For this, I'm joined by Kim Jae-chun, Dean and Professor of Seogang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Very warm welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's begin with you, Professor Kim. Now, US President Joe Biden is set to meet his Chinese counterpart on Monday, today, ahead of the G20 summit in Bali, of course. And of course, we're not really expecting much of a breakthrough on Taiwan or human rights or trade or technology, but Biden is expected to raise the North Korea issue, though. And apparently, he's going to tell Xi Jinping that if North Korea continues down the path of missile and nuclear provocations, then it will mean a greater US presence in Asia. But he's saying it's going to be up to China to decide whether it's going to pressure Pyongyang or not. So what do you really make of this statement?
You're right, Soo-young. There's not going to be any breakthroughs when two leaders meet before G20, and that includes North Korean issue as well. Look, we all know that China is not going to do much to steer North Korea into the path of denuclearization. China, to the contrary, is blaming the United States for North Korea's missile provocation. North Korea is testing these missiles because of the Iraq-US joint military exercises, because the US is provoking North Koreans, and North Korea is just being reactive here. So the US should stop these military drills first. You have to reduce your military presence on the Korean Peninsula first. Now it seems to me that Americans are counterattacking to a certain extent. Look, North Korea has been escalating these provocations because you guys are helping them from behind. So if you let North Koreans go down that path of provocations, we have no option but to increase our military presence on the Korean Peninsula, possibly increasing troop presence in South Korea and deploying strategic military assets more aggressively. One thing that China has to see in Northeast Asia is increased military presence of the United States. So my take is that, sure, it's not going to change China's policy to North Korea, but still it's going to put some serious pressure on Chinese.
So in a way, while Biden's going to say it's up to you guys, he's actually putting some direct pressure there on the Chinese. And Dr. Klingner, do you think this is going to work? Do you think Xi Jinping will take heed and put pressure on its neighbor, Pyongyang?
Unfortunately, no. In the past, Beijing was willing to allow incrementally stronger UN resolutions when North Korea did a particularly egregious violation of UN resolutions, such as a nuclear test or an ICBM test. But what we've seen most recently, including several times this year, is Beijing as well as Moscow have blockaded or prevented U.S. attempts at having stronger action taken against North Korea, whether it's a new resolution or greater enforcement of UN resolution sanctions.
Professor Kim, well, you recently wrote that the standoff between Washington and Beijing has actually worked to the advantage of North Korea. Could you elaborate on this point? And does this make further testing on North Korea's part even more likely?
I think North Korea is sort of taking advantage of great power rivalry between the US and China. And North Korea is taking advantage of bifurcation of the international order, if you will. Now we have two blocks in the world. I mean, to put it very simply, we have two blocks, a liberal bloc represented by the United States and totalitarian bloc represented by China and Russia. Now, North Korea's strategic value to totalitarian bloc looms larger than ever because of the strategic competition between the US and China and the US and Russia. that I think is the reason why China and Russia are supporting North Korea from behind. I mean, there are times when China and Russia cared about North Korea's nuclear programs. Now it seems that they don't really care. They don't really care about North Korea going down that path of provocation. And I think North Korea understands this dynamic. That said, it seems that China and Russia, particularly China, don't really want to see another nuclear test by North Korea. Because, as I said, it could lead to increasing military presence of the United States in Northeast Asia. It could lead to strengthening of trilateral security cooperation between South Korea, U.S., and Japan. That, I think, is the reason, one of the reasons why North Korea is being a little bit circumspect about another nuclear weapons test here. But at the end of the day, I think North Korea would do whatever they want to do. We test nuclear weapons that could raise many eyebrows in Beijing, but Beijing is not going to abandon us because of our strategic value. I think it's quite interesting because South Korea doesn't like great power rivalry, whereas North Koreans seem to cherish great power rivalry as of now.
Right, they really thrive on division, it seems. And well, Dr. Klingner, now, as President Joe Biden goes to these global summits, that's quite some coverage about how he has he's going into this with renewed confidence or a new spring in his step after the US midterm elections, which are still rolling in. They seem to indicate that the Republicans have a slimmer majority in Congress than expected. And of course, the blame's been placed on former President Donald Trump. And of course, Democrats seem quite happy about this. But to perhaps outsiders, American society looks as divided as ever. How do you think the run-up to the 2024 race is going to affect President Biden's foreign policy priorities?
Well, 2 years is a very long time in American politics and really any country's politics. But I think even if what was going to be called the red wave, if the Republicans had done very well in both the Senate and House of Representative elections, I don't think it really would have affected the U.S. policy towards North Korea, as long as North Korea refuses to have any kind of dialogue, let alone negotiations with the United States. So the Biden administration has restored or repaired the relations with both Seoul and Tokyo. We now have very good bilateral relations with both of our allies, as well as increasing trilateral cooperation on security issues. Also, the Biden administration, along with the Yoon administration, resumed the combined military exercises and rotational deployment of U.S. strategic assets that President Trump had canceled. So right now, allied deterrence is stronger than it was before. If North Korea agreed to negotiations, then I think we'd have greater pushback on the Biden administration, because we don't know what the parameters of an acceptable denuclearization agreement for the Biden administration would be. But right now, we're really just having deterrence and defense. What has been disappointing, though, is the Biden administration hasn't really increased pressure on North Korea as it pledged to do. There's a lot the U.S. could be doing, not only against North Korea, but also China and other foreign entities that are violating UN resolutions. In 2017, the U.S. Congress said there were 12 Chinese banks, including the Bank of China, committing money laundering crimes in the U.S. financial system, and we've taken action against none of them. So there is more we can do, even with Beijing being obstructionist in the UN Security Council.
Professor Kim, you've just been to Washington, and I wonder how you're looking at the political situation in America in the lead up to the 2024 presidential race. I mean, from the perspective of US allies, what do the divisions in American society and, of course, the possible dreaded re-election of Trump or possibly a Trumpian character really indicate for the future of America's role in global governance and security?
Well, Bruce pretty much got that question covered, but if I could share my 2 cents on the outcome of the US midterm election, I would say that the US democracy is much more resilient than we tend to give credit to. I sort of expected that that there's going to be a red wave. I also expected that these election deniers, these Trumpian candidates would make great inroads. But was I wrong? I mean, American electorate was smart and very circumspect, and they penalized Trumpian election deniers. Now, Trump looks quite vulnerable. Sure, American partisan politics is still very much polarized. Midterm did serious damage to Donald Trump, but Trumpian and first American, America Firstism is still very much intact. Ron DeSantis, who is Florida governor, is one of the biggest winners of the midterm election. And now he has a serious bid for the presidency, but DeSantis himself is a bit of a Trumpian, in my personal opinion. He's Ivy League Trump, so to speak. But then again, after the election, I hope the U.S. would be able to restore some semblance of normalcy in domestic politics, which I think is a necessary condition for the U.S. to play a more proactive role in the world. Foreign policy starts at home. You got to put your house in order to become a more effective leader abroad.
Professor Kim, well, obviously, countries, friends of America, they've been hoping that America will perhaps ease some economic policies after the midterm elections. And, well, it's South Koreans, Europeans, Brazilians, the Japanese, they've been quite outraged over the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which, of course, they say that discriminates against their automakers in the US market. And they've been hoping for some adjustments after the midterm race, but do you think this process is going to be easy?
Well, adjustment is not going to be easy because it has to come from basically legislative initiatives, and Congress people are pretty much on their own. I mean, they put their constituency interests before any other consideration. I mean, I think the U.S. Congress as a whole is pro-alliance, but some Congress people don't really understand full ramifications of their legislative actions on the U.S. alliance management. I personally believe that it is the right thing for South Korea and other American allies to cooperate with the United States on the U.S. supply chain resilience policies. But we do need a better coordination mechanisms between the U.S. and the U.S. allies on supply chain policies. The U.S. is saying that, well, we have to decouple with Chinese on these key industries, such as semiconductor industry and lithium battery industry, because Chinese aren't really playing by the rules, because China is undermining rules-based international order. I agree, but my question is whether there is a rules-based order between the United States and U.S. allies on the supply chain resilience policies. I doubt it. I doubt it very seriously. So the U.S. and U.S. allies will have to think about how we can be resilient together, not just the United States. It has to be collective resilience, not just American resilience.
And your thoughts on this, Dr. Klingler? Do you see this process really moving forward, talks on the IRA?
There are several competing objectives or priorities. So on the one hand, as Professor Kim pointed out, we do need to improve our economic security and supply chain guarantees, and that means diversification away from China. And we've seen South Korean as well as other businesses and industries doing that. But the Inflation Reduction Act, is protectionist. It likely is not compliant with either the WTO or the Chorus FTA. So we'll have to work with Congress to try to ameliorate that, because on the tactical level, some South Korean companies will be hurt by it, some will be benefit from it. But we can't resort to protectionism, against our friends and allies. But the problem is there's not a great urge for free trade in Washington. Both political parties seem to rely more on protectionism for domestic economic purposes or for political support. So it is going to be, I think, an uphill battle to try to undermine or undo some of the protectionism that the U.S. has done in really the last two administrations.
I see. Well, this is where we're going to have to end the discussion today. That was Kim Jae-chun, Dean and Professor of Sohang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Bruce Klingler, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you both of you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Also, thank you to our viewers for tuning in and starting your week with us. We'll be back on Tuesday, Korea time. Do tune in then. Have a great day wherever you are. Bye-bye.